Welcome to Dead Good Stories. We have some disturbing and scary horror stories for you tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like, comment, or subscribe. Otherwise, lie back, relax, and let sleep consume you. The day I received the letter from my estranged father was the day my life spiraled into chaos. We hadn't spoken in years, our relationship severed by his unpredictable temper and my relentless desire for independence. The letter was simple, filled with a few shaky lines claiming he was dying and needed to see me one last time. I couldn't help but feel a mix of dread and curiosity. After days of wrestling with my emotions, I found myself driving to his decrepit house on the outskirts of town. As I parked the car, a familiar unease settled in my stomach, memories flooding back, arguments, broken promises, the suffocating grip of his anger. Stepping onto the cracked pavement leading to the front door, I hesitated, feeling the weight of the past heavy on my shoulders. Pushing the door open, I was greeted by the dim light of the musty interior, the air stale and filled with the scent of neglect. The wallpaper peeled in places, revealing ghostly patches of paint beneath, while shadows clung to the corners like secrets waiting to be uncovered. The living room was a testament to disarray, filled with outdated furniture covered in dust, the remnants of a life long forgotten. My heart raced as I took tentative steps forward, the floorboards creaking underfoot, as if echoing my growing anxiety. I called out, my voice swallowed by the silence. There was no response, just the sound of my heartbeat thrumming in my ears, quickening with each passing moment. As I moved deeper into the house, the light seemed to fade, the shadows lengthening and shifting as if they had a life of their own. The living room opened up to a hallway that seemed to stretch endlessly, the darkness at the far end inviting yet foreboding. I felt drawn to it, a compulsion urging me to investigate, despite the lingering dread that clawed at the back of my mind. I approached the first door on the left, the paint chipped and faded, and gently pushed it open. Inside was a small bedroom, its bed unmade and covered in a thin layer of dust. The room felt cold, as if it had been abandoned for years, yet there was an unsettling familiarity that sent shivers down my spine. I stepped back into the hallway, my mind racing. What had happened here? Where was he? Each step felt like a journey into the past, a path lined with the ghosts of our memories. As I neared the end of the hallway, the last door stood slightly ajar. Hesitating for a moment, I pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit room that seemed to pulse with a hidden energy. In the center stood a chair, its surface worn and faded, facing a wall covered with photographs. I moved closer, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't understand. Each picture depicted moments from my childhood, birthdays, family gatherings, smiles frozen in time. But as I examined them, an unsettling realization dawned on me. They were not just memories. They were meticulously arranged, each image capturing a moment of my life through a lens of obsession. I felt a cold dread creeping in, as if the very walls were closing in on me. The shadows in the room flickered and the air shifted, thick with an unseen tension. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, and as I fell, my gaze locked onto a photograph that sent chills coursing through me. It showed my father and me in a moment of laughter, yet my eyes were drawn to the figure standing just behind us, an indistinct shape, lurking at the edge of the frame, its presence obscured but unmistakably there. Suddenly the door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled to my feet, but the room felt constricting, as if the walls were inching closer. The shadows twisted around me, morphing into figures that flickered at the edges of my vision. The whispers I had tried to ignore now surged in volume, a chaotic chorus that drowned out my thoughts. I felt trapped, like a moth drawn to a flame, ensnared in a web of my father's making. Desperate to escape, I rushed toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. I pounded on it, feeling the wood beneath my fists yield slightly before resisting my efforts. The photographs lined the walls, watching, judging. I felt the weight of their gaze upon me, as if they were demanding answers I didn't have. Then I heard it. A low, guttural sound emanating from the shadows, a voice that resonated deep within me. It echoed my fears, revealing every doubt I had ever harbored about myself and my choices. I was trapped in a manifestation of my own making, unable to differentiate between the past and the present, his voice merging with the whispers that filled the room. In a moment of clarity amidst the chaos, I realized that the horrors I faced were not solely a product of my father's actions. They were intertwined with my own insecurities and fears. The room became a battleground, a reflection of the struggle I had fought for years, the fight to separate myself from a toxic legacy, to reclaim my identity. With one last push, I threw myself against the door, feeling it yield beneath the weight of my desperation. I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath as I turned to glance back at the room. The shadows writhed and twisted, and I caught a fleeting glimpse of my father's silhouette, distorted and menacing, before I fled into the night. As I drove away, the house faded into the distance, but the shadows of the past remained, lurking in the corners of my mind. The whispers had quieted, but I could still feel their presence, a haunting reminder of the choices that had shaped me. In that moment, I understood that I would always carry the echoes of my past. But I was determined to forge a new path, one illuminated by my own choices and not the darkness that had once consumed me. The day I received the letter from my estranged father marked the beginning of a spiraling descent into chaos. For years we had maintained a chasm of silence between us, a painful barrier erected by his unpredictable temper and my desperate need for independence. The letter, with its few shaky lines claiming he was dying, stirred a whirlwind of emotions within me, a mixture of dread, curiosity, and the faintest flicker of guilt. After days of wrestling with my conflicting feelings, I found myself driving toward his decrepit house on the outskirts of town. Each mile seemed to stretch into an eternity, the familiar landscape fading into something foreign and unsettling. As I parked my car outside the cracked pavement, a weight settled in my chest, memories flooding back, arguments, broken promises, and the suffocating grip of his anger. Stepping onto the path leading to the front door, I hesitated, feeling the past creeping back in, haunting me with its familiar presence. Pushing the door open, I was greeted by the dim, musty interior, the air stale and filled with the scent of neglect. The living room lay before me, a testament to disarray, with outdated furniture covered in dust and remnants of a life long forgotten. Shadows clung to the corners, whispering secrets I could almost hear. My heart raced as I stepped further inside, the floor creaking beneath me, echoing my growing anxiety. I called out, but my voice dissipated into the silence, swallowed by the weight of unspoken words that lingered in the air. As I ventured deeper into the house, I felt a strange sensation of being observed, a disquieting energy that prickled the back of my neck. The dim light seemed to flicker, playing tricks on my eyes as I wandered through the narrow hallway, a sense of foreboding enveloping me. Approaching the first door on the left, I hesitated before pushing it open. Inside was a small bedroom, the bed unmade and covered in dust, untouched for ages. The room felt cold, as if it had been abandoned by warmth and hope. I stepped back, the unease tightening around me, my mind racing with questions. What had happened here? Where was he? With each step I took, the atmosphere grew heavier, the shadows elongating and darkening as I moved toward the end of the hallway. The last door stood slightly ajar, and my instincts screamed at me to leave, to turn back and forget this place. But something compelled me forward. I pushed the door open, revealing a dimly lit room that pulsated with a hidden energy, a darkness that felt almost alive. In the center stood an old, worn chair, its fabric frayed and faded, facing a wall covered in photographs. A chill ran down my spine as I approached, drawn by an invisible force. Each picture captured moments from my childhood, birthdays, family gatherings, smiles frozen in time. But as I examined them closely, an unsettling realization dawned on me. They were not just memories, they were meticulously arranged, a gallery of my life through a lens of obsession. A wave of nausea washed over me. I felt as if I were being suffocated by the very essence of my father's fixation. The photographs bore witness to our shared history, but they also unveiled the disturbing truth of his invasive presence in my life. I recoiled, overwhelmed by the feeling that the walls were closing in, and the shadows that flickered at the edges of my vision grew darker, more pronounced. Then, in an instant, the door slammed shut behind me, reverberating through the room like thunder. Panic surged within me as I scrambled to my feet, but the oppressive atmosphere felt suffocating, constricting around me. The whispers that had lingered in the corners of my mind erupted into a chaotic symphony, an unrelenting chorus of voices that seemed to claw at my sanity. In that moment of chaos, I stumbled backward, my gaze locking onto a photograph that sent a jolt of fear through me. It showed my father and me laughing, but lurking behind us was an indistinct figure, a shadowy shape that seemed to leer at the camera, its presence both familiar and terrifying. The room warped, shadows twisting into figures that danced at the periphery of my vision. I felt the past closing in around me, a noose tightening as I grappled with the memories I had tried so hard to forget. I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making, unable to discern where his influence ended and my fears began. Then, from the corner of the room, I heard a sound, a low guttural noise that echoed deep within me, reverberating through my bones. It resonated with my most profound fears, unraveling the threads of composure I had carefully woven over the years. I felt the walls pulse with my heartbeat, each thud a reminder of the terror that haunted me, and I realized I was ensnared in a manifestation of my father's shadow, the grip of our shared history pulling me deeper into darkness. Amidst the chaos, a flicker of clarity emerged. I understood that the horrors surrounding me were not solely a product of his actions. They were entwined with my own insecurities and regrets. The room had become a battleground, a physical representation of the struggle I had fought for years. The fight to separate myself from a toxic legacy, to reclaim my own identity. With a surge of determination, I threw myself against the door, feeling the wood yield slightly beneath the weight of my desperation. I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath, but as I turned to glance back at the room, a figure materialized within the shadows. My father's silhouette emerged, distorted and menacing, a representation of everything I had sought to escape. I bolted for the exit, the cacophony of whispers crescendoing behind me, and I could feel his presence pushing against me, trying to pull me back into the darkness. As I reached the front door, I pushed it open with all my might, breaking free from the suffocating grip of the past. I fled into the night, the cool air filling my lungs as I ran, the sound of my heartbeat drowning out the lingering echoes of his voice. As I drove away, the house faded into the distance, but the shadows of my past remained, lurking in the corners of my mind. The whispers quieted, but I could still sense their presence, a haunting reminder of the choices that had shaped me. In that moment, I understood that confronting my father meant confronting myself. The fear, the anger, and the sadness intertwined with my very being. The past would always linger, but I was determined to step into the light, to reclaim my narrative and forge a new path, free from the shadows that had once threatened to consume me. This happened about a month ago, and I still can't make sense of it. I've been running the same route every evening for years. It's a habit by now. I leave my apartment around 6 p.m., jog through the small park near my place, loop past a few local shops, and return home by 6:45 at the latest. It's a routine I know by heart. One particular Thursday evening started off like any other. I stretched, put on my running shoes, and set off, feeling the familiar rhythm of my feet hitting the pavement. The sun was low but still visible, bathing everything in that warm, late afternoon light. I reached the park, just like always, and turned onto the path that cuts through the trees. I remember glancing down at my running app for a second, seeing that I was about 1.5 miles in, and then nothing. The next thing I knew, I was standing at my front door, drenched in sweat, gasping for air like I'd been running for hours. For a moment, I thought I'd had a heat stroke or something, but as I fumbled for my keys, I glanced at my phone. It was 10:30 p.m. I stared at the screen in disbelief. Almost 4.5 hours had passed, and I had absolutely no memory of where I'd been or what I'd done during that time. I stood there panting, trying to piece it together, but my mind was completely blank. My first thought was that maybe I'd just gotten lost or wandered off somewhere without realizing it. But when I opened my running app, I felt my stomach drop. The GPS tracker had recorded every step I took, and the route was bizarre. It wasn't a straight line or even a loop like my usual path. Instead, the map showed me zigzagging all over the city, darting down alleyways, crossing major roads multiple times, looping back on myself over and over. There were sections where it looked like I'd stopped for a few minutes, only to sprint off in a completely different direction seconds later. It didn't make any sense. I don't even know how I could have covered that much ground in that amount of time. And the speed, there were bursts where I was moving far faster than I'm capable of, even on my best day. I checked my body for any signs of injury, scrapes, or bruises. Nothing. The only evidence that something strange had happened was the soreness in my muscles, which felt as if I'd pushed myself way beyond my limits. I sat there on my doorstep for what felt like hours, staring at the map on my phone, trying to convince myself it was some kind of glitch. I tried talking myself into the idea that maybe I'd been sleepwalking or had some kind of weird episode, but the more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. The idea of being out there, running blindly through the city with no awareness of where I was or what I was doing, felt deeply wrong. Over the next few days, I tried retracing my steps, hoping something would jog my memory, but it was useless. It was as if that entire chunk of time had been wiped clean from my mind. I checked security cameras at nearby shops, hoping to catch a glimpse of myself, but nothing showed up. It was like I'd vanished into thin air for those 4 hours. The strangest part came about a week later. I was looking through my phone, trying to figure out if I'd downloaded any new apps or done anything different that day. I noticed a photo in my gallery that I hadn't taken, a blurry image of what looked like a dark alleyway, time-stamped at 9:14 p.m. that night. There was no reason I would have been there, and I have no memory of even being in that area. I haven't gone running since. 2 weeks ago, I started noticing a faint tapping sound coming from my bedroom wall. At first, I thought it was nothing, maybe some pipes settling or the usual creaks and groans that old houses make. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, tapping out a pattern that didn't seem to match any natural rhythm I'd heard before. It would start in the early hours of the night and continue until dawn. The tapping grew more frequent, always starting around the same time. It seemed to get closer, shifting from the far corner of the room to right above my headboard. I tried ignoring it, thinking it was probably some small animal trapped in the walls or an issue with the plumbing, but deep down I felt a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. One night, after a long day of working from home, I was typing away on my laptop when I noticed the tapping again. This time, something was different. As I typed, I heard the sound repeat itself from the wall, following the same rhythm as my keystrokes. It was like an echo, matching each letter I typed with eerie precision. I stopped, hands hovering over the keyboard, and the tapping ceased as well. When I resumed, it started up again, perfectly in sync with me. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some kind of auditory illusion or a coincidence, but it felt too precise. Over the next few nights, it got worse. Every time I worked late, I'd hear the tapping, always perfectly mirroring my own actions. I started to experiment, changing up my typing speed, switching to different tasks. But no matter what I did, the tapping adjusted itself, staying perfectly in tune with me. One night, while I was writing, I coughed. A moment later, I heard a soft, muffled cough echoing back from the wall, almost as if someone was sitting just on the other side, mimicking me. My pulse quickened, and I sat there, frozen, straining to listen. The room was silent for a moment, and then I heard the cough again, fainter this time, as if it was moving deeper into the wall. I started to panic. I tore my room apart, looking for some kind of explanation. I checked behind the furniture, inspected the vents, even peeled back a bit of wallpaper in desperation, but there was nothing there. No wires, no speakers, no signs of anything that could be producing the sound. The wall was solid, unremarkable. There was no logical explanation for what was happening. I tried telling myself it was stress, that I was just imagining things, but then the sound began to change. It wasn't just the tapping anymore. I'd catch faint rustling noises like someone shifting around, and sometimes I swore I could hear the faint sound of breathing. It was never constant, always coming and going in fits and starts, but it was enough to keep me on edge. A few nights ago, I decided to record it. I set up my phone and left it running overnight, hoping to capture the sound. The next morning, I listened back to the recording. For the first hour or so, it was just the usual tapping, but then I heard something that made my blood run cold. There was a soft scraping sound, followed by a faint, barely audible whisper. It was impossible to make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. A soft, mocking imitation of my own typing. Since then, I've tried everything, turning up music, wearing earplugs, sleeping on the couch. But no matter what I do, I can still feel it. Even in the silence, even when I'm out of the room, there's this nagging sense that something is there, just on the other side of the wall, waiting. I've always been meticulous about my online security. I use a password manager, two-factor authentication, and I never reuse the same password for different accounts. So, when I found myself locked out of my email last week, I thought it was odd, but figured it was just a simple mistake. I tried to reset my password, but that's when I noticed something strange. The security question wasn't mine. It asked, "What is your favorite memory?" I had never set that question, not for this account or any other. Confused but not overly concerned, I reset my password using an alternate email. Everything seemed fine, but the next day I was locked out again. This time the security question was different. "What is the name of your first pet?" Again, something I'd never used. I went through the process of regaining access and I thought that would be the end of it. But then it kept happening. Every time I logged in, the security question would change to something else, each time more unsettlingly personal. "Where did you break your arm in 3rd grade? What was the color of your childhood bedroom?" These were details about my life that I hadn't shared with anyone, things that had never been online or mentioned in passing. It didn't make any sense. I checked my other accounts and everything seemed normal. No strange login attempts, no alerts, nothing out of place. But my email kept getting locked again and again, always with a new security question that felt like it was pulled from the deepest corners of my memory. I changed my password 3 more times, each one more complicated than the last. But it didn't matter. Somehow the questions continued to change, as if someone was actively digging through my past. The unease turned to something closer to dread when I received a text from an unknown number. It read, "Nice try." There was no context, no follow-up, just those 2 words. I stared at my phone, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. I tried tracing the number, but it led nowhere, just an unregistered burner phone. I decided to dig deeper, hoping to find some explanation, some clue about what was happening. I checked my email's login history, and that's when I noticed something I'd overlooked before. There were access attempts from various locations across the country, all within minutes of each other. It was impossible for someone to physically be in so many places at once. I changed my password yet again, but the anxiety didn't go away. I started to notice other oddities around my devices. My computer would glitch randomly, the cursor moving by itself for a second before snapping back into place. Files that I didn't remember opening would be listed as recently accessed. I even found a document titled Answers saved on my desktop one morning. When I opened it, it was blank, but it hadn't been there the night before. Then, 2 days ago, I got an email from myself. The subject line read, "Is this you?" There was no message, just an attachment, a series of screenshots of me sitting at my desk typing away on my laptop. They were time-stamped for the past week, all taken at random intervals when I thought I was alone. The angles were unsettlingly close, as if someone had been standing right behind me, capturing every moment. I've gone through every possibility in my head. Maybe I've been hacked, but that doesn't explain the security questions, the personal details. Maybe someone's been spying on me, but how? I've checked my entire apartment for cameras or bugs and found nothing. And now, every time I try to reset my password, I'm met with a new question that feels like it's taunting me, reminding me of things I'd long forgotten. I've shut down my email and disconnected my computer, but I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. There's a gnawing sensation that somewhere out there, someone knows everything about me, down to the smallest detail, and no matter how many times I change my password, they'll always be one step ahead. I live in an apartment complex, and I've always kept to myself. Most of my neighbors do the same, except for the man across the hall. He's an older guy, probably in his late 50s, with thinning hair and a face that never seems to show any emotion. He doesn't greet anyone, never takes part in any small talk, and always seems to be watching. At first, I thought he was just a loner, someone who preferred his own company. But a couple of weeks ago, I started noticing something strange. It began with a tiny red dot. Late one night, as I was watching TV in my living room, I saw a faint red light reflecting off the glass of my window. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first, but it moved in small, erratic patterns. I assumed it was a laser pointer from one of the neighboring buildings or maybe even a trick of the light. But when I glanced outside, there was no one there. No sign of anyone who could have been aiming it. Over the next few days, the red dot kept appearing, always late at night, always moving in slow, methodical patterns across my window. I started to feel uneasy, but I told myself it was probably just some kids playing around or a piece of faulty equipment reflecting off the glass. But then I began to notice something that made my skin crawl. The dot didn't just appear on the window, it followed me. When I moved from the living room to the kitchen, it would reappear on the kitchen window. When I sat in my bedroom, I'd catch it hovering outside, tracing the edges of the glass, almost as if it were searching for me. I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. I'd peek outside my window, scanning the parking lot and the surrounding apartments, but I never saw anyone. It was as if the source of the light was always one step ahead, always hiding just out of view. Then, one evening, as I was coming back from work, I saw him, the neighbor across the hall. He was standing in his doorway, staring at my apartment. As soon as he saw me, he quickly turned and disappeared inside. That's when I noticed something small and metallic in his hand, something that looked like a miniature camera with a red laser sight attached to it. It all clicked in that moment, and a sense of dread washed over me. He'd been watching me. I decided to confront him the next morning. I stood outside his door for a moment, gathering my thoughts, but when I knocked, there was no answer. I waited a minute longer, then knocked again, but he never responded. Later that day, I reported it to the building manager, explaining that I thought my neighbor was using some kind of laser pointer or camera to spy on me. They assured me they'd look into it, but nothing ever came of it. That night, the dot returned, more active than ever. It moved in tight circles around my living room window, darting back and forth as if agitated. I pulled the curtains closed, but that didn't help. Moments later, I saw the light squeezing through the tiny gap between the curtains, still searching, still following. I decided to set up my phone to record, hoping to catch some proof that I wasn't imagining things. The next morning, I checked the footage, and what I saw made my stomach twist. For hours, the dot moved around the room, tracing the outline of my furniture, hovering over the spot where I had been sitting, even lingering over my bed as I slept. But the most unsettling part came at around 3 a.m. The laser dot disappeared from the window entirely, and for a few minutes nothing happened. Then I saw the faint outline of a figure standing just outside my door, perfectly still. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it was him. He stood there for nearly 5 minutes, then quietly turned and walked back to his apartment. Since that night, I've kept all my curtains closed, but I still see the red dot every so often, slipping through the smallest gaps, like it's searching for a way in. I don't feel safe in my own home anymore. A couple of weeks ago, I decided to download a new fitness app called StepSnap. It was one of those step tracking apps designed to keep you motivated, and it seemed pretty straightforward. You set daily goals, track your progress, and it would give you little achievements when you hit certain milestones. Everything worked fine at first, and it even encouraged me to walk more throughout the day. But after about a week, I started receiving notifications that didn't make any sense. One morning, I got an alert that read, "Great job reaching the alley today." I hadn't walked through any alley. In fact, I'd been at home all day working. I chalked it up to a GPS glitch, thinking maybe the app had miscalculated my location. But over the next few days, the messages got stranger. "You burned 50 calories walking past the red car." This was odd because I don't know anyone who owns a red car, and I hadn't been outside all day. I double-checked the app's history, and sure enough, it showed a route that I had supposedly walked, weaving through my neighborhood in places I'd never been. I brushed it off, figuring it was some kind of software error. Then one night I woke up to a new notification. "Nice work stepping up the 5th floor stairs at 3:12 a.m. That one hit me hard. I live on the 2nd floor of my building, and there's no way I was walking around at that hour. I checked the app's activity log, and sure enough, it showed me climbing several flights of stairs in a building I didn't recognize. I tried to convince myself it was just the app malfunctioning, but my anxiety wouldn't let it go. The following day, I decided to uninstall StepSnap completely. I held down the app icon, selected delete, and waited for it to disappear. Instead, I got an error message that read, "Error, cannot complete action." I tried again and again, but every time the same error message appeared. It was as if the app refused to leave my phone. I checked my phone's settings and tried to force stop it, but it wasn't listed among the active apps. It was like it wasn't even there, despite the fact that I could see the icon, tap it, and open it like normal. Every time I opened it, the screen would display a map showing me walking routes I had supposedly taken, all at times I knew I'd been asleep or at home. The notifications kept coming, and each one became more specific, more unnervingly accurate. "Great job avoiding the puddle by the bakery. You've reached 1,000 steps near the gas station on 7th Street. These were places I hadn't been in years, but somehow the app seemed to be tracking them as if I'd walked there recently. I thought it might be some kind of scam, so I reset my phone to factory settings, figuring that would get rid of it for good. It worked. At least that's what I thought. But the next morning, I woke up to another notification. This time not from the app, but from my phone's lock screen. It read, "Your location has been shared." I checked the settings and found that my location services had been turned back on, even though I'd made sure they were disabled after the reset. The worst part was that Step Snap was back on my phone, sitting there as if I'd never uninstalled it. I started noticing other changes too. My smartwatch, which was synced to the fitness app, began counting steps even when I was sitting still. Sometimes I'd wake up in the morning to find I'd somehow taken thousands of steps while I was asleep, as if the app had recorded me walking around my apartment all night long. It even recorded my heart rate spiking at odd intervals, always in the middle of the night. A few days ago, I got a final notification that made my blood run cold. We're watching. Keep moving. Since then, I've tried everything to remove the app, resetting my phone again, disconnecting from all my devices, even contacting my phone's manufacturer. But it's still there. And now, it's tracking me, even when my phone is off. I've started to wonder if it's not just the app anymore, if somehow my every move is being monitored, mapped out, and stored somewhere I can't reach. No matter what I do, I can't seem to escape it. I installed a dashcam in my car about 6 months ago, mainly to have a record in case of accidents. It was one of those high-resolution models with night vision, capturing every detail of the road ahead. Reviewing the footage had become a habit after long drives, especially since I tend to travel late at night when the streets are mostly empty. It was reassuring to see my journey play back smoothly, just me and the quiet road. A month ago, I was watching the footage from one of these late-night drives, a familiar route that led through my neighborhood. Everything seemed normal at first, the empty streets, dimly lit by the occasional street lamp, the soft hum of the engine. But then, as my car passed a certain block, I noticed something strange. A man walking along the sidewalk, wearing a dark hoodie with the hood up, his head lowered. He wasn't doing anything unusual, just walking at a steady pace, but something about him caught my eye. I watched as he faded out of frame and my car continued down the road. But then, less than a minute later, he appeared again. He was ahead of me now, walking in the exact same spot, wearing the same hoodie, taking the same steps at the same pace. It was as if the video had looped, but I could see that my car had kept moving forward without stopping. I paused the footage, rewound it, and played it again. The man vanished from view, then inexplicably appeared further ahead, as if he had jumped through space and time to end up in front of me. I rewound several more times, trying to find some logical explanation. Maybe it was a glitch, an error with the dash cam, but everything else was perfectly normal. My speed, the background, the timestamps. It was only this man who seemed out of place, as if he didn't belong in the flow of the recording. I decided it was some kind of odd coincidence, shrugged it off, and went to bed. The next night, I drove the same route home, and once again, he appeared. Same hoodie, same pace, walking in the same spot. This time, I made a point to look at him as I drove by. He didn't acknowledge me, didn't even look up, just kept walking with his hands shoved into his pockets. I kept my eyes on him until he was out of sight, then glanced back at the road. My heart skipped a beat when I saw him up ahead again, already walking in front of me, even though there was no way he could have gotten there so quickly. When I got home, I pulled up the footage immediately. As before, there he was, appearing first on the right side of the screen, then suddenly further ahead, like a glitchy video game character resetting to his starting position. It was unsettling, but I convinced myself it was just a trick of the dashcam or my tired eyes playing games. Then, one night, it happened while I was stopped at a red light. I glanced to my right, and there he was, standing perfectly still, facing away from me, no longer walking. My skin prickled with unease. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, waiting for him to move. But he stood there, motionless, until the light turned green. As I drove off, I looked in my rearview mirror and he was gone. Vanished without a trace, as if he had never been there at all. I became obsessed with checking the dashcam footage after every drive. Each time I found him in different spots along the road, always walking, always ahead of me, even when it was impossible. One evening, I slowed my car to a crawl, hoping to catch a better look, but as soon as he left my frame, he reappeared up ahead, taking the same steady steps as if nothing had happened. It was as though he existed only within the confines of my dashcam, a phantom tethered to the lens. Things escalated last week. I was driving home late, later than usual, and the roads were completely deserted. I thought I'd take a different route to avoid seeing him, just for my own peace of mind. As I turned down a side street, my headlights caught something reflective in the distance. My heart sank when I realized it was him again, standing perfectly still in the middle of the road this time, directly facing my car. He didn't move, didn't step aside, just stood there, his hood obscuring his face. I slammed on the brakes, but before I could react any further, my dashcam flickered, the screen going black for a split second. When it came back on, he was gone, and I was left staring at an empty road. I sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, then drove home as quickly as I could. The next morning, I checked the dashcam footage, and to my horror, the man was still there, but this time, he wasn't walking. He was standing next to my car, close enough that I could see the folds of his hoodie. He stayed there for nearly 5 minutes, just standing next to the driver's side door, unmoving, before the footage cut out entirely. When it resumed, he was gone. I've stopped using my dashcam altogether. I've tried resetting it, wiping the memory card, even replacing it with a brand new one, but every time I plug it back in, I find that same footage, that same man. It's as if he's become a permanent fixture, somehow embedded in the device itself. Now, whenever I drive at night, I can't shake the feeling that he's out there, waiting to step back into frame. I moved into my apartment about a year ago, and from the start I noticed how thin the walls were. I could hear every creak, cough, and conversation from my neighbors, but over time, I learned to tune it out. Late-night noises became the soundtrack of my life, and I found it oddly comforting to know I wasn't alone. Then about a month ago, something changed. It started with faint piano music. I would hear it in the early hours of the morning, long after I had gone to bed, playing just above a whisper. The melody was simple, repetitive, and always the same. At first, I thought it was coming from one of the apartments next door, maybe someone practicing late at night. But as the nights went on, I realized it wasn't coming from any particular direction. It felt like it was seeping through the walls themselves, surrounding me no matter where I stood. One night I couldn't sleep, so I decided to investigate. I walked around my apartment trying to pinpoint the source of the music, but it seemed to shift as I moved, growing fainter when I approached the walls and louder when I stood in the middle of the room. It was unsettling, but I convinced myself it was just some weird acoustics or a neighbor's late-night hobby. I tried using earplugs to block it out, but I could still hear the music faintly, as if it were playing inside my head. A week passed and the music grew clearer. It wasn't just random notes anymore. I began to notice slight pauses, like someone's fingers hovering above the keys, hesitant to continue. It gave the impression of someone trying to remember an old tune, fumbling through the emotions. I started paying more attention, and that's when I noticed the change. The melody was gradually slowing down, and with each passing night, it felt less like a song and more like a question, lingering in the air, waiting for a response. I asked around the building, hoping someone else had noticed it, but nobody knew what I was talking about. No one else had heard the music, not even the neighbor who lived in the unit directly next to mine. It was as if it existed solely within my apartment, a private performance meant only for me. One evening, I decided to stay up all night to see if I could catch the music in the act, maybe even confront whoever was playing. I turned off all the lights, sat down on my couch, and waited. The hours crawled by, and just when I was about to give up, the first notes floated through the room, soft and hesitant, like a distant echo. It was clearer than ever, and I could feel the weight of each keystroke, the subtle tremble of fingers against the piano. I walked to the kitchen where the sound was strongest, and stood in the dark, holding my breath. For a moment the melody faltered, then continued, more urgent now, as if it knew I was listening. I stayed there for what felt like hours, caught in this strange, one-sided concert, until finally the music stopped. There was no fading out, no trailing off. It ended abruptly, like a door slammed shut. The silence that followed was deafening, and for the first time I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched, like someone was standing just out of sight, waiting to see what I would do next. I hurried back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily that night. The next morning I noticed something new. A small, old-fashioned piano key, yellowed with age, had appeared on my kitchen counter. It wasn't there before, and I had no idea where it had come from. I don't own a piano, and I never have. I picked it up, examining it closely. It was chipped on one end, and there was a faint smear of something dark on its surface, like it had been used recently. I set it back down, trying to convince myself that I was just overtired, that it must have been there all along and I'd simply never noticed. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I tried to ignore the music after that, but it became harder to pretend it wasn't happening. The melody played on, night after night, and each time it grew more insistent, more demanding. I'd wake up to find new objects placed around my apartment, a single piano string coiled around my doorknob, a tiny piece of sheet music tucked under my pillow, the faint scent of old wood and varnish hanging in the air. Last week, I woke up to find the piano key had moved from the kitchen counter to my nightstand. It was upright, as if someone had placed it there with care, directly facing me. I've started keeping it in a drawer, hoping that if I ignore it, the music will stop. But every morning I find it back on the nightstand, always in that same position. I've tried recording the sound on my phone, hoping to capture some evidence, but whenever I press play, there's nothing but silence. The music refuses to be captured, as if it exists only in the moments when I'm most vulnerable, when I'm alone in the dark, listening to those echoing notes and wondering who or what is playing them. Now, every night, I lie awake, waiting for the first note, knowing that the music is waiting too, and with each passing night, it feels like the invisible pianist is getting closer, one keystroke at a time. It started with an unknown number. At first, I didn't think much of it. Who doesn't get random calls every now and then? I assumed it was another telemarketer, and when I picked up, I was met with nothing but static. No robotic pitch, no pre-recorded message, just a faint crackling that filled the silence. I hung up and brushed it off as a glitch or a prank, but the calls didn't stop. They came at odd times, early in the morning, late at night, even during lunch breaks at work. The same unknown number, the same static, the same unsettling emptiness on the other end. After a week of this, I blocked the number, hoping that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The calls continued, now from different unknown numbers, each one untraceable. Every time I'd pick up, only to be greeted by that same static, the faint, irregular crackle that seemed to pulse in time with my own heartbeat. There was something else, too, buried beneath the static, like a distant, muffled breathing, barely audible, but unmistakable. I convinced myself it was my imagination, some trick of the mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was on the other end, listening to me as intently as I was listening to it. After a month of this, I stopped answering altogether. I'd watch the phone buzz and vibrate, willing it to stop, hoping that if I ignored it long enough, the calls would just go away. They didn't. Instead, they became more frequent, more insistent, like an itch that wouldn't go away. I'd come home from work and find my call history filled with dozens of missed calls, all from different unknown numbers, all at odd intervals throughout the day. Then one evening, I let one of the calls go to voicemail. I couldn't bring myself to listen to it right away, so I let it sit there for hours, taunting me, before I finally gathered the courage to play it back. I expected the usual static, but this time there was something different. The static was still there, but layered beneath it I heard a voice. Faint, garbled, as if it were struggling to be heard, but there nonetheless. It repeated the same phrase over and over, slowly, methodically. "Are you there?" I tried to rationalize it, convince myself it was just a glitch in the recording. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. There was intent behind those words, a purpose that I couldn't quite grasp. I replayed the message countless times, trying to make out more, but every time, it was the same question, spoken in the same lifeless tone, buried beneath the hiss of static. The next day, the calls increased. My phone would vibrate every few minutes, the screen lighting up with a new unknown number, each call more persistent than the last. I'd watch it buzz on my desk, my anxiety mounting with each missed call. Eventually, I turned the phone off completely, hoping that would finally give me some peace. That night, I woke up to the sound of ringing. Disoriented, I reached for my phone, only to remember that it was still turned off. I checked every room, every device, but the sound continued, coming from somewhere deep within the house. I followed it to the living room, where I found my old landline phone glowing softly, its cord trailing off into the shadows. I hadn't used that phone in years, hadn't even thought about it until that moment. But there it was, ringing insistently. My hands trembled as I lifted the receiver, and as soon as I pressed it to my ear, the static returned. This time it was louder, more invasive, almost as if it were trying to force its way into my head. I listened, paralyzed, as the breathing returned, louder now, clearer, until finally the voice spoke again. "I know you're there." I dropped the receiver, the sound echoing through the empty room, and backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. The phone continued to ring, its glow casting long, eerie shadows across the walls, until I finally yanked the cord out of the wall, silencing it for good. I stood there, staring at the lifeless phone, waiting for it to ring again, but it didn't. The next morning, I found something strange on my cell phone. Even though it had been turned off all night, the call history showed dozens of missed calls, each one logged at different times throughout the night, every single one labeled unknown. I stared at the screen, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it. I knew it wasn't possible, that it had to be some kind of mistake, but the evidence was right there, staring back at me. I've changed my number twice since then. I've stopped using my landline altogether, and I keep my cell phone on silent at all times. But the calls haven't stopped. Every now and then, when I check my phone, I'll find a new voicemail waiting for me, always from an unknown number, always the same message. Are you there? Lately, the calls have started coming from numbers that look familiar, combinations of digits that resemble my own phone number, my address, even my birth date. It's as if whoever or whatever is calling knows more about me than I'm willing to admit. And now, every time I look at my phone, I half expect it to start ringing, that static-filled voice asking the question I've come to dread, a question that no longer feels like a mere inquiry, but more like a demand. When I first moved into my new apartment, I was ecstatic. It was small but cozy, with large windows that flooded the space with natural light. The neighborhood felt vibrant, with friendly neighbors and bustling streets. However, it didn't take long for me to notice something peculiar about my neighbor, Mr. Thompson, who lived directly across the hall. At first glance, he seemed harmless enough, an elderly man with a kind smile and a penchant for gardening. He would often be seen tending to the potted plants that adorned his small balcony, carefully nurturing them with the care of someone tending to their own children. I admired his dedication from my own window, where my plants often drooped, neglected in favor of my busy schedule. But as time went on, I began to notice oddities in his routine. Mr. Thompson would often be awake late into the night, his lights flickering on and off at strange hours. The sounds from his apartment echoed through the thin walls, the scraping of something heavy against the floor, a faint thumping, as if he were moving furniture, or perhaps something far more sinister. I tried to dismiss it, chalking it up to the quirks of old age, but my curiosity got the better of me. One evening I decided to bake cookies and bring them over as a friendly gesture. After all, I thought it was always nice to introduce oneself to the neighbors. I knocked on his door, the sweet smell of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies wafting in the hallway, but there was no answer. I waited a few moments, unsure of what to do. Just as I was about to turn away, I noticed a strange noise coming from inside, a low rhythmic tapping that seemed to echo like a heartbeat. It was disconcerting, but I brushed it aside, telling myself I was overreacting. I returned home, placing the cookies on my kitchen counter, and tried to forget about the strange encounter. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off with Mr. Thompson. I began to watch for him when I left my apartment, hoping to catch a glimpse. He rarely ventured out during the day, only emerging at odd hours, often late at night when the streets were empty. One night I heard the thumping sound again, louder this time, accompanied by muffled whispers that seemed to seep through the walls. I pressed my ear against the cool surface, straining to hear, but the whispers faded before I could make out any words. I felt a chill creep up my spine, and for the first time I questioned what was happening behind that door. Determined to uncover the mystery, I decided to stake out my own apartment. I sat in the dim light of my living room, eyes glued to the door across the hall. Hours passed, the night deepening, and just when I thought I wouldn't see anything, Mr. Thompson finally appeared. He stepped out of his apartment, dressed in a dark coat that seemed too heavy for the mild weather. His movements were unnaturally stiff, almost robotic, and he didn't look left or right as he walked down the hallway. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was in a hurry, his footsteps echoing ominously in the silence. Curiosity consumed me, and I quietly slipped out of my apartment to follow him. I kept a safe distance, my heart racing as I shadowed him down the stairs and into the quiet streets. Mr. Thompson moved with a strange urgency, glancing over his shoulder as if he sensed someone was watching him. The city lights flickered above, casting eerie shadows that danced along the sidewalk. He led me to a small park, its empty benches bathed in the faint glow of a single streetlight. He paused by an old oak tree, leaning in as if to listen to something hidden within its gnarled roots. I stayed back, heart pounding, wondering what I was witnessing. Suddenly, he reached into his coat and pulled out something dark and glistening. I squinted to get a better look, but could only see a flash of silver beneath the dim light. He began to bury it in the ground, digging with frantic movements, his breath coming in quick bursts. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, as I realized whatever he was hiding was significant. After a few moments, he stood back, his chest heaving, and stared at the ground as if waiting for something. I felt a surge of panic rising in my throat. I wanted to turn and run, but found myself rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the scene unfolding before me. As I watched, the whispers returned, this time louder and more distinct, swirling around the park like an unseen fog. They seemed to emanate from the very ground Mr. Thompson had just disturbed, words I couldn't quite decipher blending into a cacophony of hushed tones. I could sense a heaviness in the air, a palpable tension that enveloped the park. After a moment that felt like an eternity, Mr. Thompson turned and began walking back, his eyes vacant, as if he were in a trance. I waited a few beats before following him back to the apartment complex, each step filled with dread. I managed to slip back into my apartment just as he reached his door, my mind racing with questions. In the days that followed, I could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on me. The rhythmic tapping continued, but now it felt more urgent, more frenzied, as if whatever was buried beneath the oak tree had awakened something deep within Mr. Thompson. I often caught glimpses of him through my window, pacing back and forth in his apartment, his fingers twitching as he tended to his plants with manic fervor. One evening, the tapping grew louder than ever, resonating through the walls like a war drum. I felt a primal fear grip me, and I knew I had to act. I decided to confront him, to demand answers. But as I stood at his door, the static energy that filled the hallway made me hesitate. Instead of knocking, I found myself listening, hoping to catch a glimpse of the truth. The whispers returned, rising and falling in an unsettling rhythm, and suddenly, the door swung open. Mr. Thompson stood before me, his eyes wide and unblinking, and I felt a rush of fear wash over me. I backed away, instinctively reaching for my phone to call for help, but before I could react, the door slammed shut, sealing away whatever dark secret lay within. Since that night, I've kept to myself, avoiding Mr. Thompson and his strange rituals. I never see him outside anymore, and the whispers have faded into silence. I often wonder what he was hiding beneath that oak tree, and whether it still stirs in the darkness, waiting for someone to discover it. Now, whenever I hear a faint tapping or catch a glimpse of movement through the window, I can't help but feel that whatever Mr. Thompson buried is still there, buried deep beneath the surface, waiting for its time to resurface. The fear gnaws at me, leaving me to wonder if I will ever truly escape the shadows that lurk just outside my door. After years of living in the city, I decided to spend a weekend in a small cabin in the woods, hoping to escape the chaos and noise that had come to define my life. The cabin belonged to a friend of a friend, a rustic little place surrounded by towering trees, nestled against a serene lake that glimmered like glass. It was the perfect getaway, a chance to disconnect and recharge. The first evening was peaceful. I spent hours reading on the porch, the scent of pine filling the air. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sounds of nature shifted, with crickets chirping and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I felt a sense of calm wash over me, a welcome change from the frenetic pace of city life. As night fell, I decided to take a walk by the lake, drawn by the moonlight reflecting off the water's surface. The trees loomed tall and shadowy around me, their branches swaying gently in the wind. I could hear the soft lapping of water against the shore, a soothing rhythm that seemed to echo my thoughts. But soon, that tranquility began to change. A sense of unease crept in as I walked further from the cabin. The forest grew denser, the darkness more profound. Each step seemed to amplify the sounds around me, the crackling of twigs beneath my feet, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of unseen creatures in the underbrush. I brushed off the discomfort, attributing it to the unfamiliar surroundings and the fading light. As I neared the edge of the lake, I noticed something unusual, a faint glow emanating from a cluster of trees further down the shore. My curiosity piqued. I approached, straining to see through the thick underbrush. The glow pulsed softly like a heartbeat, casting eerie shadows that danced among the trees. I felt a magnetic pull urging me closer, even as a voice in the back of my mind warned me to turn back. I stepped cautiously, carefully navigating the roots and uneven ground until I finally broke through the trees and emerged at the water's edge. The glow was more pronounced now, illuminating a small wooden platform that jutted out over the lake. It appeared old and weathered, as if it had been forgotten by time, yet it radiated an otherworldly beauty under the moonlight. On the platform stood a figure, their back turned to me. I couldn't make out any details, but the outline was distinct against the shimmering water. The figure seemed to be swaying slightly, as if caught in a trance. I felt a rush of adrenaline mixed with a strange sense of dread. Something about the figure was unsettling, the way it moved, too fluid, almost unnatural. I should have turned back then, but an inexplicable force held me in place, compelling me to stay and watch. The figure began to extend its arms toward the water, fingers splayed wide as if reaching for something just beneath the surface. The glow intensified, casting rippling reflections across the lake, and I could see a faint shimmer rising from the depths, reacting to its presence. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I took a step back, feeling suddenly exposed under the weight of that gaze. It wasn't the figure I was afraid of, it was the water. I became aware of a darkness lurking just beneath the surface, something ancient and powerful. The glow began to pulse more rapidly, as if the figure and the water were engaged in some sort of communication, an unspoken exchange that sent a chill racing through me. The figure tilted its head slightly, and in that moment, I felt a jolt of recognition, as if I were staring into a mirror reflecting something deep within myself. It was a fleeting sensation, replaced quickly by a rush of confusion and fear. I could see the outline of its face, a shadowy visage that seemed to shift and waver in the glow. But I couldn't make out any features, just a blur of darkness that seemed to pull at the edges of my consciousness. In a moment of clarity, I realized I had to leave. I turned on my heel, panic igniting in my chest as I stumbled back through the trees, the branches clawing at my arms. I could feel the glow behind me, a presence I could not shake, drawing nearer with each hurried step. My heart raced as I sprinted toward the cabin, the familiar sounds of the forest replaced by a cacophony of whispers, like 1,000 voices calling my name, pleading for my attention. I reached the cabin, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. I pressed my back against the wood, straining to listen, waiting for any sign that I had not imagined what I had just seen. The whispers outside faded to silence, and the only sound was the pounding of my heart echoing in my ears. As I settled into bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I pulled the blankets tightly around me, trying to dispel the chill that clung to my skin. Sleep came in fits and starts, haunted by dreams of the glowing figure and the shimmering water, beckoning me to return. The following day, I decided to leave early. I packed my things and drove away from the cabin, the forest looming ominously behind me. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of the trees swaying gently, the lake shimmering like a polished stone, and the faintest glow flickering at the water's edge. I felt a shiver of recognition, as if the lake were bidding me farewell, a lingering reminder of the mystery I had barely begun to unravel. Even now, back in the city, I can't shake the feeling that something remains, tethered to that night in the woods. The whispers have returned in my mind, teasing at the edges of my thoughts, urging me to remember. The glow that once seemed so inviting now feels like a warning, a reminder of the darkness that lies beneath the surface, waiting for someone to take the plunge.